an undergraduate student, the history of modern India spans from the late 18th century to the first half of the 20th century. But in trying to understand modern India as a historical category, one has to be very careful. The construction of this category involves concepts and terminologies that are Eurocentric, most of which cannot describe the Indian reality adequately. In the earlier episode, Professor Amit Bhattacharya of Jadavpur University discussed some of the common problems that any student of Indian history has to encounter. In his words, the concept of modern India has to be understood with reference to the impact the European colonial powers, especially the British, had on this country. These powers helped in the spread of Western education, science, technology, and culture. They also brought India under the fold of an international capitalist economic order. However, the real nature of this impact remains debatable. One broad view is that the British acted as a catalyst of progress. However, another view looks down upon the British colonial rule as a reactionary phenomenon. The focus of this debate has been the concept of modernity introduced by the British. Dr. Bhattacharya argues that contemporary Indian response to it was complex. People with vision made a forceful bid for modernity, but gradually it created a social divide between the Western educated urban elite and the common people. Even the practice of modernity by the elite was fraught with contradictions. Let us now hear what Professor Bhattacharya has to tell us about the Indians' approach to modernity.
The fourth section of our discussion is on our modernity. Now, there is an article by Partho Chattopadhyay. It's a thought-provoking article captioned Our Modernity. Now, in that article, he referred at length to Rajnarayan Bose's work, Shekal or Ekal, Those Days and These Days, which was published in 1873. By those days, he meant the days before the introduction of English education, and by these days, he meant the days after the introduction of English education. And in that book, he dwelt on many things, and one of which is the body, the physique. And he wrote that the Bhadralok people, the Babu people, had become very feeble. Nowadays, they have shorter lifespans. And he, in fact, identified 4 factors behind all these things. One is a change in environment. And while dealing with this question, he referred particularly to the breaking out of malaria, spread of malaria. Now, this is rather surprising because the West brought with it also modern medicine. So why should it be that there should be a spread of malaria? Now, definitely one part of it, which is very interesting, which is related to the establishment of colonial rule, is a railway network. And of course, overproduction. Railway network is very important because at the time of the construction of railways, normal flow of water was impeded. So there was stagnant water and the breeding ground for malaria. So apparently railways is something very modern, and it also helps in the spread of a disease, a malaria. That is one. Of course, Rajnarayan Bose did not refer to railways. We know about it later from the writings of other scholars. The second is food, food habits, bad food, harmful food, excess of drinking. Excess of drinking is was part of the Babu culture. Labor, lack of labor, untimely labor, lack of physical exercise. This is the third cause, according to him. And then the change in the way of life. He in fact makes a comparison between an English educated Babu and an ordinary person. Interesting discussion. Now, Partho Chattopadhyay refers to Rajnaran Bose's this particular work, and he observes that we should apply the methods of reason to identify or to create specific technologies that are suitable for our purposes. We should apply reason to create technologies suitable for our purposes. And in fact, what is regarded as modern or progressive by the Western capitalist standard could also be retrogressive for a country like India. It depends on the specific historical situation. That brings us to another concept of modernity, that is the Swadeshi concept of Swadeshi, very important, well-known concept. Swadeshi literally means indigenous, no doubt about it. But it means also a lot of other things. It means fight against drainage of wealth. It means self-reliance, dependence on Atma-Shakti, self-strengthening movement. It also means revival of indigenous crafts, setting up of modern industries, boycott of foreign products, consumption of indigenous goods, national education, etc. Now, Swadeshi in the context of colonial India has to be anti-British. It has to be anti-British, and it has also to be self-reliant. These are the two primary features of Swadeshi. And in fact, one can have the ideas about Swadeshi from advertisements. Advertisements are very important sources for getting an idea about the cultural atmosphere, cultural milieu of the time. I will refer to one or two advertisements. One is advertisement given in 1908 by the manufacturers of Kesharanjan hair oil. Quote, "Today the Bengalis have risen up from their age-old slumber. Those who had till recently to depend on others, even for insignificant articles, are now finding out ways of manufacturing those necessities in their own country. Japan today has earned a respectable position in a civilized world because of the awakening of a national industry. Likewise, after such a long time, the Bengalis have at last taken the oath of protecting their Swadeshi industries. If you are a true patriot, if you are really sincere about the revival of dying national industries, then come forward and use our highly perfumed Kesharanjan hair oil, which is one of the glorious examples of Swadeshi industries." That is one. Another interesting advertisements where one can see that traditional images were put forward to serve something modern. One of the advertisements on Deshi soaps was as follows, quote, "Why do you waste money by buying foreign soaps? Help us to promote Swadeshi industry by buying Griho Lakshmi soaps. Our washing soaps are the best available in the market." Unquote. Now here we have the concept of the Griho Lakshmi. Griho Lakshmi concept is a concept of the ideal Bengali Hindu woman. She is confined within the family, whose main duty is to look after the members of the family, and it was to the inner domain that she is attached. And here one can notice a contradiction between inner purity as represented by the ideal of Griho Lakshmi and the outer world as represented by the victorious foreign companies. So here the traditional concept is being used to achieve a modern result. There is another related to the drainage of wealth from India to Britain. And here we have some pieces from a person who was not only a writer but who himself was an entrepreneur. Jogesh Chandra Ghosh, he was a professor, and he was a founder proprietor of Sadhana Ushadhalaya, one of the most important Ayurvedic companies of Bengal. Here, in one of his speeches, he referred to the drainage of wealth, and also made a fervent appeal to the indigenous physicians in the following way. Quote, Chobonprash, Mokorodhwaja and others are like bright gems in the Ayurvedic system of medicine. Lakhs of rupees can be earned by selling those abroad. Every year, the wealth of India is being siphoned off by the introduction of foreign drugs. Is there none among the Indian physicians who can earn money by exporting Mokorodhwaja, Chobonprash, Ashokarishta, etc. abroad? Will they strive for making our motherland prosperous by propagating Ayurveda in foreign countries? Unquote. Now, this piece, it is not only modern but also national in outlook. And in fact, modernity was very much associated with nationalism, anti-British in various aspects. Now, very recently, one scholar, S.P. Mohanty by name, has identified alternative modernity in medieval Oriya literature in the Lakshmi Puran by Balaram Das. Now, Balaram identified himself as a Shudra writer, and he rendered the Sanskrit Ramayana into Oriya. And he used a particular rhythmic form in the Lakshmi Purana. Now, the Puranas generally targeted the non-elite people. They're intended to domesticate indigenous tribal population for their assimilation into the Brahmanical order, Brahmanical ideological order. And so, their texts, the Puranic texts, are basically hegemonic in character. On the contrary, Balaram Das's text, Lakshmi Purana, is a counter-hegemonic text, according to Professor S.P. Mohanty. And it is explicitly feminist, narrative centering on the actions of a strong goddess, Lakshmi, challenges male Brahmanical authority and advocates both feminism and caste equality. Now, as notions, Brahmanical male authority, patriarchy, caste inequality, these are feudal or pre-feudal in character, and so pre-modern. So the demand for the rights of women and equality among the castes, all the castes, are modern ideas. So we have the ideas of modernity in alternative modernities. We can get it from regional literature also. Now that brings us to the last part of our discussion, that is our own observations. Now, when we talk about modernity, we should take particular objective conditions into account. This concept is a product of some order from situation, some specific situation. So that should also be taken into account. And modernity is not always something universal. Yes, there are some universal elements in modernity, but it is not always universal. When you talk about Western science, Western reason, critical outlook, we have to keep in mind that these concepts were the products of a particular historical situation. All ideas are products of particular historical situations. And in the case of England, in the case of Britain, it is the transition from feudalism to capitalism. But in a feudal country like India, which was transformed into a colony and a semi-feudal country, modernity gets integrally connected not only with the struggle against the feudal elements or pre-feudal elements, but also against foreign control. So there are two aspects here. One is the anti-feudal or anti-medieval, anti-obscurantist aspect, and the other is the anti-imperialist, anti-foreign, anti-British aspect. And Western civilization it represented modernity in its own way. But when it comes to India, to a colony like India, it assumes a most brutal and savage form, a form which had nothing to do with modernity. You cannot say modern to policies which are savage, which are brutal in nature. And so, in the colony, one has also to fight for national identity, for independence, for political independence. And Indian people fought against the Western modernity, but the Western modernity against which they had been fighting was a modernity that was associated with colonial rule. So modernity was associated with colonial policy of plunder and loot, as is evident in the case of our history. And in fact, the 19th century scholars, none of the 19th century scholars stood up for political independence. One reason was that many of them themselves were the beneficiaries of colonial rule. Many of them were new Jamindars, Narkanath Tagore, Ram Mohan Rai. They were the new Jamindars, so they were the beneficiaries of colonial rule. Now, those who fought heroically and those who laid down their lives were mainly the basic masses who were illiterate and, in a modern sense of the term, uneducated. However, despite being uneducated, despite being illiterate, in the conventional sense of the terms, they had been fighting the most modern war against colonialism. It was a modern war against colonialism. They had been fighting against exploitation for freedom and dignity, all of which are modern concepts. These are old concepts, but also modern concepts. Like the concept of reason, the Western world boasts of.
I have one question, sir. What is the difference between a bourgeoisie and a landowner of that time?
Landowner is very much tied with land, and there is always a contradiction. Whenever there is a landowner, we have the peasant or we have the serf. So it's an exploitative relationship. The rent is the most important part of feudal relationship. Landowner forms part of a feudal system, as serfs or peasants form part of the feudal system. It's a coercion, forcible extraction of more and more, even without allowing him to live for his own sustenance. The bourgeoisie is a person who basically is an urban element, not a rural element. And bourgeoisie associated with the capitalist system, the large-scale industries, modern industries. And here we have his relationship is mainly with the working class. He also extracts surplus value from the workers, exploits him, and get profits, accumulates more and more money out of by exploiting them to the worst possible extent. And they represent two different systems, the bourgeoisie and the feudal class. And in fact, there could be some situations when we have the landlords as also the bourgeoisie in the same economy. In the countryside, we can have feudal control. In the urban areas, we can have the control of the bourgeoisie.
So I have one question. After listening to the whole paper, the question that arises in my mind is that the whole concept of modernity, whether be it in India, was it hegemonic of the West? Was it a Western hegemony somewhere that was there?
No, yes. Since the concept of modernity in India emerged along with the emergence and consolidation of colonial rule, British colonial rule. So the concept is very much tied up with that. And they came on what they described as on a civilizing mission. They introduced English education, they introduced Western science, technology, etc. And they said that all these are modern and that all these things would be beneficial to the Indian people. But the people of India knew from their own experiences, or most of the people, not the majority of them, at least there are some people who wish to remain under British tutelage, and they were opposed to the common people struggle. They did not fight against the British. There are many people in the 19th century who did not fight. But the people who fought against, they had their own conception of modernity, though even if they might not have realized that, common people, the basic masses might not have realized that they had been fighting the most modern war, but they had been fighting it for their own existence. They had been fighting against exploitation. They had been fighting for their freedom, for their dignity. And they held foreign rule responsible for the absence, for the elimination of all these things, all these rights and privileges.
Modernity as a concept is not something that is universal. It has several layers and relates to particular objective conditions. In the West, modernity is integral to science, reason, critical outlook, or spirit of inquiry. These phenomena were the products of broad socio-economic changes at the base levels of European countries as a result of transition from feudalism to capitalism. But in a feudal country like India, which was transformed into a semi-feudal country by the consolidation of colonial rule, modernity does not end with a struggle against feudal or pre-feudal concepts, but extends to fight against colonial rule. Modernity in the colonies often assumed a brutal, exploitative, and savage form. For the people of the colony, progress or modernity also represents the national struggle against that foreign rule itself. In the Indian context, practice of modernity involves evolution of concepts like Atma Shakti and Swadeshi, as also construction of a national perspective through the development of national education and national industries.